Hey, good Friday to you guys. How's it going? Good to see everybody. Good to be seen by everybody. We made it. We made it to Friday. It's Friday all day. And we have a lovely Saturday tomorrow. Isn't that going to be cool? How's everybody out there? Do I have good audio? I got good audio. There we go. It's raining here where I am. But that's okay. We don't mind. It's just a little liquid sunshine on a late summer day. I don't know, maybe it started to cool off where you are and summer's not even a thing anymore. I don't know. You believe it's almost the end of August? Wow, that blew by, didn't it? Anyway. Little channel update. Hello, Katie. Hey, IR. How you doing? We're up to 764 viewers now. And that's pretty darn cool. That is pretty darn spiffy. Hello, Adam. Good to see you. But yeah, 764 viewers. Seems like quite the slow progress up to 800, onward towards 1,000. Rain means a free shower. Darn right. The heck with those public utilities. Water falling out of the sky. Why should I pay those people? But yeah, it's a slow but steady process. But it is what it is. And I wanted to address something, by the way. I've been enjoying doing the how-to first edition AD&D videos. Namely because I hope one of the things that I'm accomplishing in this is dispelling the myth that first edition AD&D is an old, clunky, and unusable system. And you guys are finding the magic in it the way that I do. I can only share my opinions and help with quick interpretations on certain things in the books. If you've just been kind of following along saying, yeah, I'll decide whether or not I want to get this based on what I hear from Bill, from the Dungeon Delver in his videos. Hey, Mike Holland, long time no see. Good to see you. Mike's over there on Facebook. Good to see you, my friend. But you really need to get them. Even if you just buy the PDFs for a few bucks a piece, I think they're $9 over on the DM's Guild. You really, really, absolutely should pick up a copy of each one of the 3 core AD&D books. Monster Manual, Player's Handbook, Dungeon Master's Guide. And read them yourself. Read them for enjoyment, because there's a lot of enjoyable stuff. Read them for education. Read them as things that you can add to your game. Don't just let them be additions to your bookshelves that gather dust. Because again, I can only get so much across to you guys as far as in-game content is concerned. I just want y'all to feel like this is a living game, that this is that AD&D, it used to drive me up the wall. There was, I see this from time to time, and I try not to look, but it's like a train wreck. You kind of look over at the horribleness. Hey, Chris. Where you see, let's read, and it's a classic RPG product. And I don't know, since sometime around the late 90s, we've kind of entered into this ironic post humor, everything has to be torn down, everything has to be ridiculed kind of mode and mindset, even with the things we enjoy. We have to rip it down. We have to tear at its foundations. That's the only way it can be enjoyed and appreciated now in current year. And do what you want. And I'm certainly not going to be the first person to say that, yeah, there's some stuff that you can poke fun at in AD&D. There's some stuff you can poke fun at in 2E, in 3rd, in 3.5, in Pathfinder, in 4E, and the whole thing's a joke, and 5th edition, and so on. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying, darn you fun havers. But when I would see these Let's Reads, they were invariably like, holy shit, what was Gygax thinking? Oh my god, I can't believe this. Level limits? Okay, old gamer guy. And shit like that just drives me up the wall. I don't want to get off on a rant. I don't want to go off on some old man yells at cloud kind of rant about that sort of thing. Just leave it be. Somebody else's sense of accomplishment to go through the Dungeon Master's Guide one line at a time, looking for things that are ironically, unironically, ironically, post-humor, post-comedy, pre-enlightenment, pre-current year, ew, gross, this take isn't it, man, kind of stuff to make fun of. If that's how somebody wants to waste their time, that's entirely up to them. So that's not what this is. That's not what I do. This is not a Let's Read where we just kind of go through, make some light commentary and poke at things. I want you guys to see the game for what it is, warts and all, as a great, if not the greatest, fantasy role-playing game. That's why I do these. And that's why I do a lot of my videos. Even when I'm not talking about the rules, even when I'm not going into the specifics of, okay, here's how best to apply this in your game. Even when I'm just talking about a game that isn't even AD&D. And I especially hope that the videos that I do where I talk about the Monday night game, I hope that inspires you, and I hope that you go out there and after hearing that and you're like, man, I want to do that. I want to bring that kind of fun to my table. A buddy of mine, Rob, was bitching about his character last night, and I was tired and I had a drink in my hand. I was actually playing. My friend Kevin was running the game. And he started in on how there was nothing on his character sheet that would let him do anything other than what he was doing. Because he was playing a fighter. And I just laughed and shook my head. I'm like, and understand something. Rob's in his late 50s. I've known Rob for 30-something years. Me trying to explain the aspect of AD&D of everything that is not forbidden is permitted, it would have derailed the game. So I didn't bother, because I've tried to have that discussion with the man. But I hope you guys are understanding, particularly if you're new to role-playing games, or new even to Dungeons & Dragons, or new to 1st edition AD&D. Everything that is not forbidden is permitted. Alright? Just because it's not on your character sheet doesn't mean it shouldn't be in your imagination. If you need only what's on the character sheet to tell you what to do, then you're not doing it right. You can play like that. But it doesn't necessarily hold that you should play like that. And the same is true for Dungeon Masters. If it's not in the Dungeon Master's Guide, make it up. Make it up. If it's cool for your game. There is no rule in the Dungeon Master's Guide, the Player's Handbook, the Monster Manual, not even Deities and Demigods, although that skates a little bit close. Unearthed Arcana. Now, I don't know about the Wilderness Survival Guide, the Dungeoneer Survival Guide, Manual of the Plains, or Oriental Adventures. I don't own those. Don't care to own those. But there's nothing in those rule books that says, hey, what happens to a demon if they put on an artifact level Helm of Alignment change and become lawful good? I've got that in my game because I thought it was a cool thought experiment. I mean, mechanically, one can say that a demon puts on the helmet, they blow their magic resistant, now they're lawful good. They're lawful good with everything that entails, but still a demon. But are they, or will they? Well, that's something I'm exploring all by myself. You, in your game, you might have a different take. You might say they immediately turn into a Solar or a Planetar or a Diva. Or they disintegrate. Or it would never work. The helmet just loses all of its magic. Or they turn lawful good, but then are immediately set on by every demon on the plane of the abyss, and they're ripped to shreds. You know, never even becomes a deal. But that is up to you, because there's no mechanic for it. Or rather, there are some mechanics. Demons have magic resistance. They failed the magic resistance, they put the helm on. The Helm of Alignment change says blah, 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 changes to the exact opposite polar line. And that's it. And you're just like, okay, they're a demon, but they're lawful good. And you never explore it any further than that. And that would be a shame. And that's why I say, go get the books, read them for yourselves, run some AD&D, and inject your ideas, because everything not forbidden is permitted. This book is a book of suggestions. Remember, we started at the back of the book, the afterword. It is the spirit of the game, not the letter of the rules, which is important. That's what matters. What you do with the game, how you make the game work, as long as it is within the general forms of first edition AD&D. And what that means is the things that are written down are the rules to follow. But if there's not a rule, you don't got to worry about it. So look at the comments. Got some comments on my little rant. Passerby says, I'm too serious to enjoy that. I already hate what they do with the Shang-Chi movies. Too much stupid humor. Yeah. I mean, a joke every now and again. You know, I remember playing D&D with Gary. I love saying that. Sorry. And we sat down at his table. It was my wife and I and a couple of other people. And he said, before he started the game up, he said, now everybody remember, this is a very serious role-playing game. We're all going to be very serious. And we all had a chuckle because we knew, you know, it wasn't. You can be a little tongue-in-cheek and enjoy your games. There's humorous stuff to be found, you know. It is just a game at the end of the day. Chris says, nearly everyone I've ever heard who's complained about level limits has also said campaigns don't last long enough for them to make a difference. And, you know, my question is, why do you care about them then? Well, generally I find, and I don't want to talk too much about demi-human level limits. I mean, we're already 15 minutes into this, and I haven't touched on today's lesson at all. But generally I find that people who complain about demi-human level limits are in games where the DM is handing out so much treasure and story points, or just doing advancement points, just like, everybody take a level, where it does start to matter because the DM has just a completely borked sense of proportion when it comes to leveling. See, that's one of the things, that's a major system that you shouldn't ignore. Otherwise, it borks the humanocentric feel of the game. Passerby says, I got a Shadowrun approach to that. I will let people make an ability roll with modifiers to see if they succeed. Well, there you go. See? There you go. Passerby's got it right. So that's just a little food for thought today. Just a little something to consider in the Twilight Zone. I need to make the PDF reader window bigger, so you guys can see that a little bit better, hopefully. We're going to talk a little bit about the underworld, or we're going to talk a little bit about wilderness and wilderness adventuring today. So let's take a gander at that. I need a rant. You're right, Katie. I do need a rant day. Are you saying that I need it like, somebody says I need a me day, or I need a spa day, or I need a vacation day? Or are you saying it like you can sense I've got all this pent up anger and I need to do that. Like, it's vital for me to do that. Not that there's not a lot of Venn diagram crossover in that, because there is. D&D was originally, or rather, I should rephrase that. D&D originally suggested to the game master that one of the tools they needed to play Dungeons and Dragons. And now I'm talking about original D&D. I'm talking about 1974 through 76 or 77, early 77 D&D. One of the tools that they needed to have was a copy of Avalon Hill's Outdoor Survival, which was a game where your character, for lack of a better term, you literally had to move around a map trying to survive lost in the woods. That was the game. It was kind of a neo role-playing game, or a proto role-playing game, rather, itself, in that you controlled one character, one piece, and moved around accordingly, and could encounter different things outside, in the outside world. Well, conceptually, Gary carried that forward. Mechanically, it's completely different. And obviously, Outdoor Survival deals with people in a then contemporary time, late 1960s, early 1970s. So you might have a watch, a compass, a hunting rifle, some food, some water, some first aid, maybe portable shelter, adventuring gear for the modern man. But Gary just took the map, the hex map for Outdoor Survival, and said, this is the fantasy world. And when original D&D was released, he said, this should be your fantasy world. And use the different markers on the map to represent castles, dungeon entrances, caves, what have you. So D&D had a very outdoorsy approach from the get-go, and AD&D continued that tradition. And I think it's a shame and Passerby, I'll get to your question in a minute, that a lot of DMs are like, they just, and don't do this, by the way. This is another best practice note from me. Don't just gloss over towns, cities, and overland travel. And we'll talk about towns, cities, villages, hamlets, what have you, at a later time. But overland travel, that fleshes out your world. If you're not playing a tournament or a convention event or some kind of, like, okay, this is going to be 5 sessions. That's it. I'm breaking out White Plume Mountain. And that's all we're playing. If you want your players to get out into the world, then for goodness sake, get into it. Get your world built. And we'll talk a lot about world building. But your characters are out in it. Your players and their characters, I should say, are out in it. And you have to you have to give them something to visualize. You can't just, your overworld can't just be in, you travel on the road for a little while. Characters should want to get lost and find and explore new and interesting things. It shouldn't just be this groove worn in the ground between town A and ruin B, between city A and town B and dungeon entrance C. Even Keep on the Borderlands has a wilderness that players can get lost in. So consider that. And we'll look at the specifics of it. Passerby says, how do I deal with a player who wants to do suicidal things? The people that will not run from the Balrog but want to charge it and are not Gandalf. You let the dice fall where they may. That's the answer. You let the dice fall where they may. Now, right here, Gary tees off. It is necessary to have a reasonably well-detailed large-scale map for conducting adventures outdoors. Naturally, the initial adventuring in the campaign will be those in the small community and nearby underground maze. For whatever reason, player desire, quest, or geas, or because of your own direction, adventuring will sooner or later move to the outdoors. What you must do to handle this is not difficult, following the general procedures given below. So Gary talks about designing hexes and so on and etc. I recommend getting some hex paper or printing some out. You can get PDFs and just print them out. If you've got a nice high capacity black and white laser printer or whatever, just print out your own hex paper and start designing from there. And if you find yourself stuck for ideas on what to design, start in the center of the map, put a dot in the middle, decide on a scale whether the hexes are 1 mile, 5 miles, 30 miles like they are in Greyhawk, or whatever. Put a dot in the middle hex, or as close to middle as you can get, and say, that's where the players start. And then use the DMG to fill out that world at large. And we'll talk about, from a player's perspective, movement rates and so on and etc. I want to look at overland travel. But consider your population density. The odds that 10 miles away from a city of 50,000 people, you're going to bump into a war party of 300 orcs. There's maybe a 5% chance of anything happening. Really. A 5% chance of anything. And as this is a civilized area, when you look at the outdoor encounter tables, which that's something I should have gone into. I should have talked about wandering monsters in dungeon design, but we'll talk about, we'll revisit that. We'll talk about those later. But your odds of encountering a red dragon in its lair 5 miles from the city that you've been living in for months are diminishingly small. Usually what you're going to encounter in those areas are other merchants or wild animals that have just wandered into the area, herds of animals, maybe bands of humanoids that are camping out, waiting to pick things off. But that's up to you. That's up to the DM to decide why those things are there. If you do roll up a huge ancient red dragon that's laired 5 miles away from the city, don't just go, ugh, that's ridiculous. Well, I won't have that there. Come up with a reason. If you're starting out with that sheet of paper with a dot in the middle, you just added a very, 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 very potent and considerable goal for player characters to extirpate the thing. Maybe the dragon is in cahoots with somebody in the city. It knows that there's hundreds of guards and talented NPCs in the city, and then if it tries to swoop down and just take all the treasure and eat all the people, it's dead where it stands. So it's working the long game, giving off some bits of its treasure to some traitorous members of the Syndics Guild in town. You know, the Praetorian Guard, the disappearances of pretty, how shall I say, ladies of the evening, isn't a serial killer in town. They're dragging him off to the dragon's lair to feed to him. So whatever your encounters are, wherever your encounters are, be they in relatively densely populated areas, moderate to sparsely patrolled areas, or uninhabited and wilderness areas, take some time to think about why they're there. Now, you have a little bit more latitude once you get to uninhabited and wilderness. It makes sense. You're 1,000 miles from the nearest major city, hundreds of miles from the nearest hamlet, and 50, 75 miles from the little sparsely populated frontier town. Patrols don't come out here. Yeah, it kind of makes sense you're going to bump into the dragon out there. But when your characters are wandering around your world, check these encounters. And these cover most terrain types: plain, scrub, forest, desert, hills, mountain, marsh. Now you might ask, well, I decided a river runs through this hex. Well, I mean, if it's not mountains, if it's forests, or even plains, that might constitute a marsh hex. Or you might go over to water encounters for it, depending on how deep and wide the river is. But there's all these different times you can check for encounters. Do not check unless party numbers over 100 creatures. Remember when I said I have 16 players in my group now, and they have 25 men-at-arms? That's 41. That's creeping up towards that number, so that may actually be. So if you wound up with a group of 10 players, and they have a bunch of infantry, and they each have competent hirelings and henchmen, well, you may start having to check each of these tables all the time. But let's take a look If you're going through forest, it's fairly dense. It can hide lots of things. So you note every bracket. And by the way, we are over on page 47, right-hand column. Every time of day, morning, noon, evening, night, midnight, pre-dawn, in a forest or in a marsh, there's a chance that the party may encounter something. Now, the least chances, I should say, are plain, scrub, desert, and hills. Mountains is actually the least. Just 2, morning and night. And then the others are 3, and then the rest are all 6 times of day. Separated by roughly 4 hours. If you go with a 24-hour day in your game world. If you're playing something really bizarre, like a tidally locked planet, the characters are having to move, strictly through the twilight area, well, you might want to adjust this. And Gary goes in and explains the procedure of this, but I think it's fairly self-explanatory. But there's something to consider when thinking about the outdoor encounter that I want you guys to think about. And that is percent in lair. Let's look over at the monster manual and let's just grab something. Storm Giant. I like Storm Giants. So let's say your characters are traveling through mountains and you dice up an encounter with Storm Giants. Percent in lair, 55. I'll just roll my percentile dice here. A 47. If the characters bump in to a Storm Giant, guess what? They just walked into his lair. Now, I don't mean they're walking along the ground. Oh, we're in a cave. We're in a dungeon. How did we get here? We were just out on the mountain trail. Consider the Hobbit. When the hobbits are in the Misty Mountains and it's storming, they go into a cave to shield from the storm for the night. What happens? They're attacked by goblins, and the goblins say, we found these miscreants hiding out on our front porch. That was a goblin lair. So your party might be traveling through the mountains, and it's a storm, because Storm Giants are like, hey, how about a little thunder and lightning tonight, sweetheart? There's 1 to 4 of them. We'll roll a d8 and divide by 2. I don't see a d4 to hand. So 5 becomes 4 to 5 is 2. So you got a couple of Storm Giants. Maybe they're brothers. Maybe they're sisters. Maybe it's brother and sister. Maybe it's husband and wife. Maybe it's a couple of friends. But the point is, your characters just encounter Storm Giants in their lair. That can happen out in the wilderness. Now, with Storm Giants in the mountains, it's fairly easy to envision that it literally might just be a favored mountainside. They brought some bracken up to sleep on. They've stuffed their treasure under a boulder. This is our home. Storm Giants, fortunately, being good, if a bit chaotic. The party's not going to get thrown off the side of the mountain. But there are other things. Why, look, gnolls. Only 20% chance in lair. They're wandering monsters. They're roaming monsters. Do we encounter them in their lair when we get down in the plains? We do not. But if you did, At that point, as the DM, it would be incumbent on you, even though this is a random encounter, to decide where those gnolls were laired. Did the characters see a hill, a cave complex in the side of a hill, as they wind down a trail on the plains, or do they see flats and platforms and trees over them as they go through the woods? Or, like the unlucky dwarves in The Hobbit, do they go into a cave to shelter from a storm, only to find out that it's already occupied by the gnolls? You just don't know. And that's up to you, the DM, to decide what that encounter is and how it works. And it fleshes out your world, because at that point, the players may decide, they see some gnolls patrolling around and they're like, that's a gnoll lair. There's 5 of us. We're average 2nd level. We're going to avoid that. But they, on their player's map, might call that the Gnoll Hills, or you might call it the Gnoll Hills. So there is a chance that a wandering monster that you encounter in the above world, or that players encounter in the overworld, in the campaign world, actually have their lair right there. They're not just passing by like the players. Now, out of doors, there is an encounter range, and should have gone over wandering monsters in dungeons when I talked about building out dungeons. We will revisit that topic, and I apologize. But the encounter distance, whether out of doors or indoors, is 1d6 plus 4. Or is it 1d4 plus 6? The point is, it's 60 to 100 feet. So I think it's a d4 plus 6. So if they're not in lair, outdoors, remember, feet become yards. So as your party crests a hill or a roll in the land, 90 yards away, you see gnolls. You see a pack of gnolls. Or maybe you don't tell the characters it's gnolls. Maybe you just see, tall, bandy-looking fellows. They don't have eyes of the eagle. They don't have wizard eye. They might mistake them for plainsmen until it's too late, until they're surrounded. And the gnolls are breaking out the cooking gear. So if you're not seeing their lair, and even if you are seeing their lair, let's say that was in their lair, the players don't spot it until they're 90 yards away. That may be close enough for Gnoll sentries to spot the characters and send a band out to deal with them. But there's always a chance that your characters, that your encounter will happen because the party steps on the lair. And I just want to share this real quick. I gotta downsize this a little bit. That is one of my favorite pieces of art by Darlene. I love that piece. Not sure if she's just an NPC, say druid, that doesn't want the adventurers walking through her grove, or maybe she's a dryad and nobody in the party has a charisma high enough that she wants anything to do with them. Or maybe she's a party member who's holding up her hand saying, "Stop. It's not safe to go further, guys. I've scouted ahead already." So we do have some above ground encounter distances. I may have misspoke about distances. I didn't do my homework. Okay, right. My mistake. Above ground is 6d4. If either party is subscribed, one more time. If either party is surprised, thinking too much about my metrics, The encounter distance is determined by subtracting the surprise value from normal encounter distance. Normal encounter distance is 6 to 24. Thus, on a surprise roll of 1, encounter is 5 to 23. And remember, that's yards outdoors. So that's 60 to 240 yards. And in the case of one segment of surprise, it would be 50 to 230 yards. In addition to shortening the encounter distance, surprise also allows the surprising party to have that number of segments as shown on the die of surprise as free and unanswered activity to move, attack, flee, etc. In addition to modification for surprise, terrain will also modify encounter distance. So if you're in a forest, it's -1 per die. So you could potentially literally step right into a group of monsters in a forest. In plains, deserts, hills, and mountains don't alter encounter distance varies. I think they should for mountains, but that's just me. And some notes about confrontation here. The adventurers and some monsters have met at close proximity, and some interaction is likely to take place. There are, however, modifying circumstances. If the monsters are intelligent and would normally deem themselves to be weaker than the party of adventurers, then they will always seek to avoid such confrontation. Now, remember, a monster in AD&D, that's a generic term. That's anything that the party encounters that they don't know what it is initially. What did I just say about the gnolls? Maybe the party doesn't recognize them. You describe them as tall, bandy-looking fellows with weapons, and they got, some dogs with them. Well, the party might think, oh, they're plainsmen, they're tribesmen, we can approach them. If the party of adventurers surprises the monsters and elects to flee the encounter, they may attempt to avoid confrontation by using free segments of action to move out of confrontation distance and evade the monsters. And then, of course, Gary mentions confrontation interaction can consist of any number of actions, singly or in combination, parlay and reaction, spellcasting, missile fire, melee combat, etc. Now, movement rates out of doors are listed elsewhere, but generally speaking, well, you know what, we can go over that. I don't want to make any suppositions about that. I completely botched the encounter distance. But before I dive into movement rates, just answer a question. I saw something where they built their map with, let's see. Adam says, if you bump into 300 orcs within 10 miles of the city, you've really bumped at the beginning of the campaign. Darn right. Gold star for you, Adam. Absolutely. He says, I saw something where they build their map with dice. That was pretty cool. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of what you can do here in AD&D. Random terrain, man. IR says, I have these dice with words on them like kiss, close, neck. I can use it. What you do in your AD&D game is your own business, good buddy. I'm not going to judge. They select a number of different dice, give them a meaning like town, mountains, toss them in the paper, and build the world that way. Huh. Fascinating. Fascinating. So if you've got a party over 100, their movement rate's going to be slowed down. That's what Gary notes here. But in no event should such adjustment slow the rate of movement of the party to below 50% of normal speed. By the way, that also counts for monsters. A party can outrun a group of 300 orcs a lot easier than they can outrun a single fire giant. The orcs are going to try and stay organized. There's going to be the whip-cracking sergeants along the flanks. Maybe ogres keeping everybody in line. on behest of the magic user that controls the orcs. So, becoming lost. Any party not guided by a creature knowledgeable of the countryside through which the party is moving, or which is not following a well-defined course, river, road, or the like, or which is not using a well-drawn and correct map, might become lost. This is determined prior to the commencement of a day's movement. Determination is based on the terrain. So you've got our terrain types, chance of becoming lost, movement, and that assumes hexes. And in forest or marsh, roll a d6. And that's the direction the party takes off in, thinking they're going the right way. To find the direction of movement as the party's lost, roll a d6, 1 to 3 indicating left, 4 to 6 indicating right. Each hex faces 60 degrees. If a loss of direction of 120 degrees is possible, roll a second d6, 1 to 3 indicating a 60 degree, 4 to 6 indicating 120. In any direction, loss is possible. Roll a single d6 with the results being read off clockwise, considering the intended direction of travel as 12 o'clock exactly. 2 chances for complete loss and movement in the exact opposite direction. 1 is right ahead, 2 is right behind, 3 to 4 directly behind, 5 left behind, and 6 left ahead. I.e., there's no chance of the party ever accidentally moving in the desired direction when the die indicates the condition of being lost exists. Direction of lost movement is illustrated below. There's a little template there. That's on page 48. Direction of travel desired. And then the various indications. As soon as the die roll indicates. Now, parties can figure out that they've gotten lost. And here, you don't just cackle and watch them stagger in circles. Gary says, tell them that they've moved in X direction rather than that which was desired, but they have seen landmarks and realize the error. If movement is into an area where the party has not already been and mapped, then immediately roll again to determine if the party will be lost the next day also. If no such lost direction is indicated, then the party will realize it has made an error, but meanwhile describe terrain as if they had actually moved in the desired direction. So you got to mess with their heads a little bit. And then there's rest. Exactly. Haven't we passed that stump before? And Gary here explains what happens if you don't rest. Beast of Burden will lose hit dice, entire hit dice, if you don't give them a chance to rest, and they can drop dead under you. And that includes characters, by the way. The example, a 12th level fighter who moves an additional 90% of movement after exceeding normal movement by 100% must rest 72 hours consecutively in order to gain 12th level ability. Prior to that period of rest, the character is effectively 3rd level. Guys, if your players are just like, no, screw it, we're marching, it's 3 days away, we don't care. It's 3 days to the dungeon. We want to get there. We don't want to get eaten by monsters out of doors. Guess what? When they get to the dungeon, they're going to be combat ineffective. And they can either walk inside and offer themselves up to the cooks working for the various monster factions inside, or they can camp out and rest, or they can rest before they get there. Now, Gary kind of goes into air combat and sea combat here, and we're we're sort of getting on. I don't want to dive too deep into that. But I do want you guys to take that into consideration. Travel. And Kyle and I did a live stream. The audio got very borked up. It's very hard to hear Kyle. You can see the stuff that's on the screen. But I want to basically do it again in the context of AD&D. So the next time Kyle co-hosts, I want to go into that, where we look at building your world as characters travel through it. Not that you shouldn't pre-create encounters. Now, let me tell you what I do for encounters. Not for getting lost, but for encounters. If the party is going on the road, as it were, they're going from the city of Greyhawk to the city of Gorna, which is in the Duchy of Jeff, because they're leaving Greyhawk to go do the Against the Giants adventures. By horse, by cart, that is about a month's travel. Sit down between sessions, make every check as they go along for random encounters. Do they get lost? Do they stumble on a village? Is there a village between here and there? So on and etc. Map everything out and make extensive notes. I mentioned earlier the idea of bumping into gnolls or a giant. And this doesn't have to not be random. I'm not saying you can't have fun with random encounters. Not at all. Not in the least. Just that you should have all this mapped out. Nobody wants the game to come to a halt every other minute while you're going, hang on a second. All right, that's an encounter. Hang on, and you flip through the Dungeon Master's Guide, and you roll on the Wilderness Encounter table. Okay, it's a storm giant. All right, okay, are they in lair? They're not in lair. Okay, 15 plus 2 to 7 hit dice, and there's 1 to 4 of them. Oh, there's 4 of them. Give me a second, guys. Can I borrow everyone's 8-sided dice real quick? I gotta, hang on. I got, or you don't do that. You don't want to tip your hand, as it were, and you got a couple. All right, so let's see. There's 2. That's 10. And you're scribbling this down or typing it. Crap, how many times did I just roll the... Nobody wants that in their game, and you don't want to be doing that in your game. Pre-stock all the encounters. You may go days or weeks of a long journey without an encounter. And you can do all that by saying the days stretch into weeks before you see another soul on your wilderness journey. Then, on the 19th day since you left the city of Greyhawk, as you climb through the hills, the Lort Mills or wherever, a furious storm strikes up. You shelter under an overhanging cliff. A booming, laughing voice reaches your ears. Ho, little friends! Did our lightning display frighten you? And standing there in the shadows, some, let's see, 5, 11, some 120 yards away, you see the looming form of a giant figure, hands on hips. Ho, 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 roll for initiative. But there you go. That's it. You do all of that beforehand. Don't leave it to random encounters in the game. If you want it to seem like you're checking, if you feel there's a mystique that's brought to it by making the players think you're checking, sure, just sit behind the screen. Just say, oh, nothing that day. Nothing that day. Nothing that day. But I think even that'll slow it down. You can smooth over the narrative. You can ask players, hey, days are going by, you're not encountering things. Is anybody changing spells that they're memorizing? Is anyone, striking up conversations? Give them a chance to role play during that period. You don't have to make it like the 17 years that pass in Ralph Bakshi's The Lord of the Rings between Gandalf leaving after Bilbo's birthday and Gandalf coming back to talk to Frodo, where it literally just like fades in and out. Summer passed into winter, and they ran low on supplies and had to eat Robin's minstrels, and there was much rejoicing. No, give players a chance to play during that period if they wish, but just ask them. If you've got, the cleric of Heronius and the cleric of St. Cuthbert in the same party, and they're having a heated religious debate, let it play out. Just tell them, that you guys are discussing and debating the whole time, but go ahead and do your thing and game. It's over this period before you even get to the storm giants or the gnolls or the hill giants or what have you. So that's very, very important. That's very important. Because, again, if you try to dice every encounter along the way every time, you're gonna find yourself kneecapped. Now, the Dungeon Master's Assistant Volume 1 encounters can help with that. But you may find, it has to run under DOS, which means, at the very least, some kind of device that can run DOSBox. Whether you can run it on your phone, but then the text is real tiny, so you got to zoom it in, or you have a laptop that's taken up footprint on the table. My Monday night game, my big 16-person game, is all online right now. So I can have the advantage. I can have it open. But I still prefer, it still stops the game if I have to go over and say, hang on a second, guys. And they hear me typing on my Model M keyboard over there with its buckling spring mechanism. That really throws a monkey wrench into game progress. So you got to have all of that stuff plotted out, in my opinion. It's almost like a module. And there's one other thing I want to mention about getting lost also before I forget this. If your characters are traveling from a major city to a major city, odds are they're following a trail. They're following a trade route. There are tracks. Maybe there's a broken, abandoned wagon along the way. There are road signs. There are patrols to keep them on the road. They're not just striking out across towards some rumored place that might exist off in the mountains. Or if they have a ranger in the party. Rangers simply don't get lost. If they have a ranger in the party, you needn't worry about the party getting lost. The ranger will know which direction to go. Or if they have a map, even if they are striking out for treasure, if they have a detailed map to guide them, the tallest tree in all the surrounding forest is a road mark. We can see it, Fred the halfling climbed a tree and looked in the distance. He can see the tree. All right, we'll keep going there. Fred, how we doing? Oh, we need to, walk a little to our left. Okay. So maps and rangers and staying on well-traveled routes means you don't ever have to worry about the party becoming lost. But you should still check for encounters. To go back to the gnolls. Maybe they're setting up, getting ready to raid caravans and whatnot. So they've set up, that they found some hills and whatnot. And don't forget magical effects for becoming lost that could overcome your ranger or your map. I mean, the eminently creepy and, in my opinion, genuinely frightening Blair Witch Project. They get lost before their sound man snaps and throws the map into the river. Something in the woods doesn't let them go. It keeps them trapped. I mean, if you're running a tiny group of people, you're running like a Halloween D&D game, a Blair Witch type of adventure where they can't get away, they can't escape the woods, is kind of effective and creepy. Are you sure you're reading that map right? I kicked that map in the river. Anyway, so this is just some food for thought. And remember, when your players are traveling over land, you got to have good montage music. Like the stuff from Bards of Greyhawk. My buddies over at the Bards of Greyhawk. Go check their stuff out. Should definitely check them out. That's some good stuff, some fine stuff. It's my buddies over there. That's Rich Lopez, and that's Justin. Not Justin. I'm sorry. God, I was looking at the wrong thing on my screen. I'm a little tired today, guys. I'm sorry. That's Jeremy and Rich, Bards of Greyhawk. Amazing music. And it's I mean, how many AD&D themed bands are there out there? I don't just mean people who like make veiled allusions to role-playing games, like drop in the word D20 or Gary Gygax. I mean, make music about AD&D. Well, those guys do. So you should absolutely check their stuff out. They did the Magnificent, and I played it a lot. I know you guys have heard it a lot. The Magnificent music that I'm working on, opening theme for the stream for. So check them out for sure. They're awesome. They contributed some great music to the show, and I'm really in debt to them for doing that. So thank you guys. So I hope that sheds a little light on wilderness adventuring. A little bit of light, because there's other types of wilderness adventuring. There's adventures in the air. There's adventures on the sea. And don't just commit yourself to the idea of wilderness adventures as just going across rolling plains or through a forest. There's frozen tundra. There's mucky, foul-smelling swamps. There's rolling hills. There's mountains. And we're going to talk about cities and towns and so on next week on Monday. And all the fun encounters you can have there. Because wow, the city encounters in AD&D. So hopefully you guys looked at the sample dungeon here in the Dungeon Master's Guide, and you kind of did what I said. You sort of took an empty area and fleshed it out with some scatter terrain and came up with sounds and smells and odd things that the party might encounter on the ground. Do the same. Pick some distances. Pick pick a row of hexes between two spots on your world campaign map. Or if you don't have a world campaign map, take a blank piece of hex graph paper and pick two spots. Dice up some random encounters. Say if the party was traveling from here to here, and let's say I got some mountains, it'll take them longer to move through those. And yes, we will talk about travel times also. What could they possibly encounter in those spaces? And just generate yourself a little list. I think you'll find yourself going, and having that on hand. That's a Bill Sylvie tip. When people say, how do you run AD&D effectively? Right there. Have your wilderness encounters plotted out all the way along. And you will find that you've got a magnificent system right in front of you for determining whether or not the characters are going to have encounters beforehand. So absolutely do check that out. So I think that's just about all we've got today. Thanks for listening to me rant a little bit beforehand. Pardon me for the encounter distance screw up. I was crossing over my city and dungeon encounters with my wilderness encounters, which should be at a further distance. But we will be back on Monday. And then, of course, Monday night, AD&D. I love playing in my AD&D game. You guys should start your own AD&D games. And I will see you all then. Thank you for stopping by. Please stay safe out there, guys. Like I said, we are at 764 subs now. Go get your friends to sign up. 1,000 subs equals mini convention. Just keep that in mind. All right. I will see you all on Monday. Same bat time, same bat channel. I love you all. Thank you for being here. You make this fun for me to do for you guys. Peace, everyone.